At 6 a.m., the sound of splintering wood jolted me awake, the kind of noise cops recognize before consciousness fully forms. I rolled from bed, heart hammering, reaching instinctively for a sidearm that wasn't there. Shouts echoed outside, authoritative, rehearsed, wrong. By the time I reached the garage, the door hung crooked, locks smashed, shelves bare. My guns were gone, tagged with orange notices claiming an HOA violation. In that moment, rage met disbelief, and something colder settled in my chest. The woman leading the group stood with a clipboard and a practiced sneer, announcing fines, seizures, and compliance as if reading scripture. Neighbors watched from porches, phones raised, curiosity outweighing concern. She said my property fell under their association, that weapons violated community standards, that resistance would escalate. I listened, silent, cataloging errors the way training teaches you to breathe under pressure. She never asked my name. She never checked the map. She never noticed the small framed badge on my wall. I'd left the force years earlier, quietly, without ceremony, trading night shifts for early mornings and a quieter life. I chose this place precisely because it wasn't governed by anyone's petty kingdom. The deed was clean. The boundaries were clear. The association's reach stopped 2 streets away. But confidence is loud, and authority, when faked convincingly, can bulldoze the unprepared. They mistook my calm for surrender and my patience for ignorance. As they drove off with my property, I stood amid broken wood and scattered screws, replaying the scene with professional detachment. Stolen firearms aren't a civil matter. Forced entry isn't a misunderstanding. False authority isn't a mistake. Each detail stacked neatly, forming a case before my coffee cooled. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I simply smiled, because I knew exactly how this story would end, and it wouldn't favor people who confuse power with permission. That certainty carried me through the morning as calls were placed, records pulled, and old instincts sharpened. I photographed everything, measured damage, saved footage, and documented names. Experience whispered patience. Let them double down. Let emails arrive. Let arrogance grow. Every step they took without jurisdiction deepened the hole beneath them. By noon, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors, and by evening, I was ready to move. I knew viewers like you would want the truth, not bravado, so stay with me. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability unfolding slowly, correctly, and inevitably. What happened next exposed how fragile fake authority really is when faced with facts, law, and someone who understands both. The first call I made changed everything. It set events in motion that the HOA could not control, predict, or escape once the truth surfaced publicly. And this was only the beginning for them. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer or the police. It was to the county recorder's office. Experience taught me that paperwork ends arguments faster than shouting ever could. Within minutes, I had digital copies of plats, boundary surveys, and the original subdivision filings pulled up on my screen. The lines were exactly where I remembered them. My property sat cleanly outside the HOA's jurisdiction, separated by a drainage easement they conveniently ignored. While documents downloaded, emails began flooding in. The HOA president wrote with clipped politeness, insisting the seizure was temporary and for community safety. She warned that non-compliance would lead to escalating fines. I noticed how carefully she avoided mentioning the forced entry or the guns by name. That omission mattered. People confident in their authority don't hedge language. People who sense exposure do. I walked the neighborhood that afternoon, not to confront anyone, but to observe. Neighbors whispered as I passed. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked entertained. One older man quietly told me the HOA had been getting bold lately, issuing citations beyond their boundaries. He said no one challenged them because it was easier to pay than fight. That admission explained everything. Bullies thrive on convenience. Back home, I reviewed my security footage frame by frame. License plates. Faces. The exact moment the garage door splintered. The clipboard woman directing the men like a conductor. They hadn't worn masks. They hadn't acted cautiously. They believed they were untouchable. I compiled the footage, labeled timestamps, and backed it up twice. If this escalated, I wanted zero gaps. By evening, my phone rang again. This time, the tone shifted. The HOA's legal liaison requested a conversation. He spoke quickly, suggesting mediation, compromise, understanding. He claimed the guns were being secured for my benefit. I asked one question: under what statute did they seize personal property from a non-member? Silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. He promised to get back to me. That night, I slept lightly, old instincts resurfacing. I thought about how many ways this could go wrong for them. Stolen firearms trigger mandatory reporting. False impersonation of authority carries penalties. Trespass escalates when damage is involved. Each action they took independently was bad. Together, they were catastrophic. And they still didn't know who they were dealing with. Before bed, I drafted a concise timeline, stripped of emotion, filled with facts. Dates. Names. Actions. Violations. It read like a report because that's what it was. Years on the force taught me clarity beats anger every time. I attached documents, footage stills, and property records. I hadn't sent it yet. I was waiting for the right recipient. When morning came, so did the reply from the HOA's lawyer. It was defensive now, almost pleading. He suggested returning the property quietly if I agreed to drop the issue. That message told me everything. They knew they were wrong. What they didn't realize was that quiet resolution was already off the table. The next step would make that impossible. The next morning, I sent my timeline to the only people who could act without hesitation, the local police department's professional standards unit. I didn't file it as a complaint. I submitted it as information related to stolen firearms and unlawful seizure. The distinction mattered. Within an hour, my phone rang. The voice on the other end paused before speaking, then said my name slowly, recognizing it. That pause told me the tone of this conversation was different. We spoke plainly. I explained the forced entry, the HOA's claim of authority, the removal of registered firearms, and the evidence I'd collected. I emphasized jurisdiction. I emphasized safety. I emphasized that guns don't disappear into temporary storage without consequences. The officer thanked me and asked for copies. I sent everything. When the call ended, I knew the machine had started moving. Around midday, 2 patrol cars rolled slowly through the neighborhood, not with lights, not making a scene. People noticed anyway. Curtains twitched. Phones came out. Authority, when real, doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. An hour later, a third car stopped directly in front of the HOA president's house. I watched from my porch, coffee cooling in my hand, as officers knocked and waited. The HOA group chat exploded. Messages flew about misunderstandings, overreach, miscommunication. Someone suggested a rogue enforcement team. Someone else suggested blaming a contractor. Desperation has a sound, and it echoed through every message. They still hadn't returned my guns. That omission spoke louder than any apology. By afternoon, I received another call, this time from a detective. He asked careful questions, confirming details already documented. When he asked about my background, I answered simply. The line went quiet again. Then he said, "That helps." It wasn't reassurance. It was acknowledgement. He told me they were treating this as a criminal investigation, not a civil dispute. That single sentence shifted the entire balance. An unmarked vehicle arrived near sunset. Two officers approached my door, professional, respectful. They photographed the damage, verified serial numbers from my records, and confirmed ownership. They didn't promise outcomes. They didn't speculate. They did, however, advise me not to communicate further with the HOA directly. That advice wasn't for my protection. It was for evidence integrity. As night fell, a moving truck pulled into the HOA storage lot down the road. I saw it because half the neighborhood was watching. Boxes came out. Doors opened. Voices rose. Someone argued. Someone cried. I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. Pressure had arrived, and it was being applied correctly. Before bed, I received one final email from the HOA president. It was short. No threats. No authority. Just a request to resolve this amicably. I didn't reply. At this point, the story no longer belonged to either of us. It belonged to the truth, and truth has a way of finishing what arrogance starts. By morning, the neighborhood felt different, like the air after a storm breaks but before the cleanup begins. News travels fast when authority collapses. People who'd avoided eye contact days earlier now waved, curious, cautious, relieved. The HOA president's house stayed quiet, blinds drawn. Silence, I've learned, is rarely confidence. It's calculation, or fear, sometimes both. The detective called around 10. He didn't waste words. They'd recovered my firearms from a rented storage unit leased under the HOA's name. Everything was intact, logged improperly, handled without protocol. That mattered. Mishandling firearms adds layers of liability most people never consider. He told me I could pick them up later that afternoon, after formal identification and paperwork. I thanked him, calm on the surface, satisfaction settling deeper. At the station, the process was professional, almost routine. Serial numbers matched. Forms signed. An officer apologized, not personally, but institutionally. It wasn't his fault, and we both knew that. When he slid the final case receipt across the counter, he met my eyes and said, "This isn't over." He didn't need to explain. On the way home, I passed the HOA office. A notice was taped to the door. Closed until further notice. No logo. No bravado. Just paper and tape. That image stayed with me. Organizations built on intimidation often collapse the moment someone refuses to be intimidated. That afternoon, a few neighbors stopped by. One woman admitted the HOA had threatened to fine her for offense that predated the association. Another man said they'd entered his yard without permission to inspect compliance. Stories stacked quickly, each one worse than the last. Patterns emerge when people feel safe enough to speak. I suggested they document everything. Some asked for advice. I gave it sparingly. This wasn't about becoming a leader. It was about restoring balance. By evening, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. It acknowledged error, apologized for procedural missteps, and offered compensation for damages. It also asked, delicately, whether I'd be willing to resolve matters privately. I read it once, then set it aside. The offer came too late and asked for the wrong thing. Privacy protects abusers far more often than victims. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative flipped. Days earlier, they'd spoken with absolute certainty. Now, every sentence was conditional, cautious, lawyered. Authority evaporates when it's exposed as imaginary. Real power doesn't need volume. It needs legitimacy. That night, I updated my timeline, adding recovered property, witness accounts, and official findings. I sent copies to the detective and kept backups. Closure isn't about anger fading. It's about records being complete. And as I closed my laptop, I knew the next chapter wouldn't be about me reclaiming what was stolen. It would be about consequences finally landing where they belonged. Consequences don't arrive with sirens. They show up quietly, in envelopes and calendars, in meetings scheduled behind closed doors. A week after I recovered my guns, subpoenas followed. HOA board members were ordered to produce records, emails, enforcement logs, and financials. What they handed over told a story far bigger than my garage door. This wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a pattern dressed up as governance. I was asked to give a formal statement, recorded this time, under oath. I stuck to facts. Dates. Names. Actions. No opinions. No insults. The prosecutor nodded occasionally, already familiar with most of it. When I finished, she thanked me and said something that stuck: "You stopped this early." She explained that unchecked HOAs sometimes escalate until someone gets seriously hurt. My case forced a line in the sand. Meanwhile, the neighborhood kept talking. A small group formed, neighbors comparing letters and fines like puzzle pieces. One family had paid thousands in penalties they never owed. Another had liens threatened over landscaping rules invented on the spot. When people realize they're not alone, fear loses its grip. Information spread faster than the HOA could contain it. The HOA president finally came to my door. She looked smaller without her clipboard, voice unsteady. She tried to frame it as pressure from above, misunderstanding bylaws, acting in good faith. I listened, because listening costs nothing. When she finished, I told her the truth calmly: intent doesn't erase impact. Authority isn't something you borrow and hope no one checks. She nodded, eyes wet, and left without asking for forgiveness. That mattered too. 2 board members resigned within days. Another hired separate counsel. The HOA's attorney withdrew, citing conflicts. Each move was strategic, self-preserving. I didn't celebrate. I observed. Systems reveal themselves under stress. Good ones correct. Bad ones fracture. A local reporter reached out, tipped by public records. I declined an interview, but confirmed documents. The story ran anyway, stripped of drama, heavy on facts. HOA overreach leads to criminal investigation. No names in the headline, but everyone knew. Accountability doesn't need theatrics. It needs sunlight. Repairs to my garage were finished by Friday. New locks. Reinforced frame. The damage vanished, but the lesson didn't. Power unchecked grows reckless. Authority questioned becomes honest or collapses. Watching that process unfold was strangely satisfying, not because I won, but because something wrong was corrected. As the investigation expanded, I understood my role had shifted. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was evidence. And what came next would decide whether this ended as a cautionary tale or a precedent others could rely on when lines were crossed again. By the time Chapter 6 unfolded, the case had grown beyond my driveway and into county offices, where spreadsheets mattered more than speeches. Investigators traced enforcement actions against maps, comparing claimed authority with recorded boundaries. The results were blunt. Dozens of properties had been cited illegally. Fines were collected without jurisdiction. Access was taken without consent. What looked like confidence was, on paper, trespass repeated until normalized. I was asked to review materials, not to advise, but to verify. Years of reports trained my eye to spot patterns others miss. Language repeated. Templates copied. Threats escalated in identical steps. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. And systems leave fingerprints. When I pointed out how notices mirrored municipal citations without authority, a clerk exhaled and said, "That explains the confusion." It didn't explain the choice. Depositions followed. I wasn't in the room, but I saw summaries. Board members contradicted one another. The president claimed guidance from counsel. Council denied authorizing seizures. Contractors said they were told enforcement was lawful. Everyone passed the weight downhill, hoping gravity would absolve them. It never does. Gravity just shows where the cracks already were. Neighbors began organizing formally, filing for a special meeting under state statute. Attendance surged. Quorums were met for the first time in years. People who'd paid quietly now asked questions publicly. Budgets were scrutinized. Votes were recorded. The illusion of inevitability dissolved when process replaced intimidation. Watching that shift was more rewarding than any apology. One afternoon, a detective called with an update. Charges were being considered, not theatrically, but carefully. False imprisonment of property. Criminal mischief. Impersonation. He warned me to expect pushback, character attacks, whispers. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. When control slips, narratives get ugly before they get honest. Sure enough, rumors surfaced. That I'd provoked it? That I'd been uncooperative? That my background made me dangerous? I countered none of it. Records speak louder than rumors, and I had records. Every time someone tried to reframe the story, another document corrected them. A settlement offer arrived, improved, detailed, generous. It asked again for silence. I declined again. Silence would teach the wrong lesson. Accountability requires memory, and memory requires a record others can find. I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in prevention. As weeks passed, the HOA grip loosened. Enforcement paused. Policies were rewritten. Oversight was invited. People breathed easier. The neighborhood felt owned again, not managed. And in that quiet, I realized the real outcome wasn't about guns or gates. It was about reminding people that authority must be earned daily, lawfully, and transparently, or it isn't authority at all. When the indictments were finally filed, they landed without spectacle, just stamped pages and quiet phone calls. 3 counts, multiple defendants, all tied to actions they insisted were routine. Routine doesn't break doors. Routine doesn't seize firearms. Routine doesn't invent borders. The law, written plainly, had no patience for euphemisms, and neither did the judge assigned to the case. Court dates drew crowds I didn't expect. Neighbors sat behind the railing, listening as emails were read aloud, as footage played, as maps were projected larger than any ego left in the room. The HOA president avoided my eyes. Contractors testified about instructions received. Board members hesitated, corrected themselves, contradicted earlier statements. Truth doesn't rush. It waits, then arrives intact. My role was brief. I authenticated records, confirmed timelines, answered questions. No grandstanding. No speeches. Just facts placed where they belonged. When cross-examination tried to suggest I'd overreacted, the prosecutor smiled and asked about the forced entry. The line of questioning collapsed. Overreaction requires provocation that never existed. Outside, a camera crew asked for comment. I declined again, but I did say one thing, carefully, check your deeds. That clip ran everywhere. Messages poured in from strangers across the state, then across the country, telling similar stories. Power copied without oversight behaves the same everywhere. That was sobering. Sentencing took less time than I imagined. Penalties were measured. Probation, restitution, mandatory training, removal from positions of authority. No jail, but consequences that linger. The judge spoke about trust, about how easily it's abused when wrapped in process. The courtroom was silent, attentive, learning. Afterward, the HOA voted to dissolve and reconstitute under strict oversight, or disband entirely. Members chose oversight. New leadership was elected transparently. Bylaws were audited line by line. A compliance hotline was established. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Difference matters. One evening, months later, I sat in my repaired garage, door open, neighborhood quiet. The guns were locked properly, legally, untouched. The badge stayed on the wall, a reminder, not a threat. What stayed with me most wasn't victory. It was the understanding that ordinary people can stop extraordinary overreach by insisting on clarity. If this story resonated, remember it the next time someone speaks with certainty they haven't earned. Ask for proof. Ask for boundaries. Ask for the law. Because when you do, the noise fades, and what's left is something solid enough to stand on together. I didn't set out to be an example, but examples appear when someone refuses to yield convenience to fear. That refusal rippled outward, changing conversations, policies, and expectations. It reminded me why documentation matters, why calm matters, and why knowing your rights isn't optional when authority pretends confidence equals permission. Especially when neighbors are counting on you. Weeks turned into months, but the ripple effect of the HOA case didn't fade. New associations in neighboring subdivisions suddenly paused enforcement, double-checked boundaries, and consulted legal counsel before issuing citations. Emails circulated like quiet warnings: check your maps. Know your authority. The story had become more than a personal victory, it had become a cautionary tale. Neighbors continued to share their experiences, creating a small network of support and verification. Fences, gates, and signage were carefully documented. Photos dated. Receipts preserved. They had learned a lesson I already knew: when authority is assumed rather than verified, consequences fall unpredictably and often harshly. Communication replaced fear. Knowledge replaced intimidation. And slowly, confidence returned to the streets I had called home. One day, the HOA president appeared at my door again, this time quietly. No clipboard. No entourage. Only words. She asked for advice on rewriting bylaws to prevent future legal exposure. I offered guidance, carefully phrased. Boundaries, documentation, consultation with legal counsel. She nodded, listening without argument. Change rarely comes willingly, it usually arrives when mistakes are undeniable. She left, and the neighborhood remained calm. The local paper ran a follow-up story detailing the changes, the resignations, the new oversight. It highlighted accountability, not my identity. The headline read: HOA reforms after unlawful seizures. No dramatization. No exaggeration. Facts only. Yet those facts traveled further than warnings ever could. I realized then that the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, the ones that reset expectations without fanfare. At home, I checked my firearms, verified their condition, and updated my records. Each step was ritual, a reminder that ownership carries responsibility, and that protection begins with preparation. The badge still hung on my wall, a symbol of discipline and awareness, not pride. Outside, the neighborhood breathed easier, no one challenging their neighbor's property, no one questioning their rights without first checking the law. Months later, during a neighborhood gathering, someone brought up the story. People laughed at the absurdity of what had happened. They shared tips, offered advice, and ensured that the lessons weren't forgotten. I didn't dominate the conversation. I just listened, occasionally offering facts. Influence, I realized, is more effective when silent, steady, and reliable. And as the sun set over the subdivision, I understood something fundamental: authority is only as strong as the proof behind it. Confidence alone can't enforce compliance. It takes evidence, boundaries, and accountability. Those lessons, though learned the hard way, would linger far longer than any anger, fine, or confrontation ever could. The final chapter didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, in the form of completed audits, revised bylaws, and a community that had reclaimed its voice. The HOA president, board members, and contractors were no longer operating unchecked. Lessons had been written into policies, enforced by oversight, and backed by law. Authority had been tested and it had failed without preparation. I spent the morning walking the neighborhood, noting subtle changes. New locks on gates, clear boundary markers, and neighbors documenting improvements. Conversations were different now, calm, informed, mutual respect replacing fear. People understood the rules, knew their rights, and no longer relied on assumption or intimidation. The neighborhood felt alive, not controlled. It was a rare sight, balance restored. The local attorney who had represented the HOA sent a final letter acknowledging the missteps, promising reforms, and offering restitution for damages. It was formal, measured, and utterly factual. No theatrics. No appeals to ego. Just accountability documented in writing. I kept the letter in my file alongside the timeline, evidence, and photographs. Every page mattered, because it formed a permanent record of what happens when authority is assumed rather than verified. I took a moment in my garage, now repaired, to inspect the firearms. Each one was secure, untouched, and in its rightful place. The badge on the wall caught the morning light, reflecting discipline, training, and vigilance. It was a reminder, not a warning. I had done my part not for vengeance, but for principle. The quiet power of preparation had prevented disaster. Months later, new homeowners moved in. They asked neighbors about the HOA. They learned about boundaries, bylaws, and authority. I gave only the briefest advice: document everything. Check the law. Don't assume confidence equals permission. That guidance was simple, but in practice, it was life-changing. The story had become more than mine, it had become a lesson. And that, ultimately, is the point. Authority, no matter how loudly declared, is meaningless without legitimacy. Confidence is fragile, documentation is permanent. Neighbors united, policies enforced, and vigilance maintained. The stolen guns were returned, the HOA reformed, and trust slowly rebuilt. The moral isn't about retaliation, it's about preparation, rights, and ensuring that power without proof cannot thrive. I finally closed the folder containing every piece of the ordeal. The documents wouldn't see the light unless necessary. The lesson, however, was clear, lasting, and visible in every careful step my neighbors now took. For those who overreach, remember, there's always someone watching, ready, and prepared. And sometimes, that someone isn't just a homeowner, they're a former cop who knows exactly how the system works.